So this is the video lecture to accompany Chapter 30 from the Ground History of Western Music, Diverging Traditions in the Late 19th Century. We've already talked about Germany in the late 19th century, Brahms, Wagner, the New German School, and we've already talked about opera in the late 19th century, Wagner, and then outside of Germany, Verdi, Puccini, Bizet, and others, and of course we've talked about the Russian opera composers, Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov as opera composers. Now we're going to talk about this stuff as it regards basically outside of Germany in non-opera genres. So we start in France. César Franck, a very important composer. He wrote a great symphony, his Symphony in D minor, which is in the standard repertoire, which is performed very frequently today. He also wrote a lot of great chamber music, but he may be best remembered for kind of creating a new style of organ composition. The French Romantic organ school, Franck, Gabriel Fauré, Guilmant, Alexander Guilmant, and Belgian composers who studied in France like Joseph Jongen and Vidor, they came up with this new style of organ composing, which is probably the second most important school of organ composition in history behind the German Baroque. So you've got the German Baroque, then you've got the French Romantic and early 20th century school of organ composition, and this is all kind of started by Franck. His Symphony in D minor, most popular French symphony aside from Berlioz. I think that's a very fair statement by the author. Gabriel Fauré. Fauré really lived well into the 20th century, but he's really thought of as being a romantic composer. Stylistically, he was quite romantic. Songs, he wrote great chansons, great songs, piano works, chamber music. But Fauré's best known and best loved piece is his Requiem. He used the Latin Requiem text for choir and orchestra, smaller orchestra, chamber orchestra. Absolutely amazing piece of music. I will play movements of the Fauré Requiem for you. It's, in my opinion, one of the greatest pieces of music ever written is the Fauré. He ran the Paris Conservatory for 15 years. He taught there. He's very influential, very important composer. That's France, centered on Franck and Fauré. Russia, we've talked about Tchaikovsky. We talked about Tchaikovsky as a opera composer. I don't remember how much of his biography I got into, but I think I covered most of it. Tchaikovsky's goal was to combine Russian nationalism, as typified by the compositions of the Mighty Handful, or the Five, the Mighty Five, who were Russian nationalists. Tchaikovsky was also influenced by Western music as well. So he kind of combined classical forms, the kind of thing that Brahms was doing, with Russian nationalism. Tchaikovsky's far and away the most popular Russian composer of the Romantic era, full stop, no arguments. He wrote 8 operas, several of which are in the standard repertoire, 3 ballets, which are the standard repertoire, Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker. I mean, this is the core of the ballet repertoire. 6 symphonies. His 6 symphonies are very, very popular, especially the 4th, 5th, and 6th, get performed with great frequency. Philadelphia Orchestra is doing Tchaikovsky's 5th in just a couple months, right at the beginning of May. And I think they've already performed his 4th this season. 2 piano concertos and a violin concerto. His violin concerto, probably the most popular violin concerto in the entire repertoire, that or the Mendelssohn. His piano concertos, especially the first, among the most popular concerti in the repertoire. Several symphonic poems and overtures, his Romeo and Juliet overture. I played just that little snippet of the love theme for you in class a couple of weeks ago. Absolutely core of the repertoire. He also wrote songs, and he wrote chamber music. So, Tchaikovsky, very prolific, and far and away the most popular of all Russian composers. In class, we will listen to a few snippets from some of his music, and we'll listen to the entire march from his 6th symphony. Okay, now, we talked about the Mighty Five, the Mighty Handful, Borodin, César Cui, Balakirev, Mussorgsky, and Rimsky-Korsakov as opera composers. Mussorgsky, typo, should be 2 S's in Mussorgsky, M-U-S-S-O-R-G-S-K-Y. In addition to his operas, he wrote some instrumental pieces, which are very, very popular. Night on the Bald Mountain, which is a tone poem. Pictures at an Exhibition. Now, Pictures at an Exhibition was originally a piano composition. Several people have orchestrated it. They took the music he wrote for piano and they rearranged it for orchestra. The most popular of these orchestrations is by the French 20th century composer Maurice Ravel. But there are at least 15 orchestrations of it out there that I know of. It's his most popular piece. There's no question that Pictures at an Exhibition is Mussorgsky's most popular piece. And we'll talk about it in class. We'll listen to some excerpts from it. He also wrote song cycles. The Nursery, Sunless, and Songs and Dances of Death. I've transcribed some of the Songs and Dances of Death to play on trombone. They're really, really cool music. But Mussorgsky, where Tchaikovsky kind of fused Russian nationalism with what was going on in France and Germany, Mussorgsky was very much a Russian nationalist. As I said, we'll listen to some of this in class. Pictures and Exhibition, his most famous piece. Basically, the story is this. Mussorgsky was good friends with an artist named Victor Hartmann. Hartmann died fairly young, and they staged a memorial exhibition of Hartmann's art. Mussorgsky went to this exhibition, and he wandered from gallery to gallery, and then he sat down and he wrote this piano suite. Each movement is inspired by a different one of Hartmann's paintings or drawings, and they are separated by promenades. The promenade is musical representation of Mussorgsky walking from gallery to gallery. Mussorgsky, he was a rather rotund gentleman, and he kind of waddled more than walked, so he actually wrote his promenades in changing 5/4, 4/4 meters, so it never has that steady walking feel to it. It kind of rolls back and forth a little bit. So he wrote these promenades and separated several of the galleries with them, and then each movement is a different artwork of Hartmann's. So, as I said, this was written for piano originally. A lot of people have orchestrated it, the most famous of which is orchestrated by Ravel. We're going to listen to the movement, The Great Gate of Kiev. It is the final movement of the suite. It's very bombastic, a lot of brass. This was an architectural drawing that Hartmann had done of a proposed gate to get to go in and out of the city of Kiev. You can see the scale here. This right here is a person. So the scale of the gate has a big bell tower, and the shape somewhat reminiscent of Russian Orthodox churches. We will listen to this movement in class. I think if we have time, we'll listen to it both on piano and for orchestra. That's a little bit of music. Also in Russia, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Rimsky-Korsakov wrote operas, and we've already talked about him, but he's probably best known for his program music for orchestra. His Capriccio Espagnol. Now, Rimsky-Korsakov was Russian, so Spanish Capriccio, that's exoticism, that's an example of exoticism. The Russian Easter Overture, which is probably my favorite piece by him, certainly my favorite piece to play by Rimsky-Korsakov. It's based on Russian Orthodox chant music, Gregorian chant. It's a fantastic piece. And probably his most popular piece, Scheherazade. Now, Scheherazade is based on the book 1001 Arabian Nights, the old story of a sultan who was going to kill one of his wives, Scheherazade, and instead, every night she told him a different story. She read him a different story from, that's where the 1001 Arabian Nights came from. And so as long as she kept telling him stories, he wouldn't kill her. So it's a symphonic suite, and it's based on 4 of the stories from Scheherazade. Very famously, there's very extensive violin solos in it, which represent the voice of Scheherazade, the voice of the narrator. Rimsky-Korsakov is best known probably as an orchestrator. The way he utilized the colors of the orchestra was groundbreaking. No one had ever created works like him, or not since Berlioz certainly, where the way he wrote the music, the way he orchestrated it was so important relative to everything else that was going on. Okay, so that's Russian. Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov from an orchestral standpoint, instrumental standpoint. In Bohemia, which is the present-day Czech Republic, we start with Frederick Smetana. Smetana we've talked about a little bit as far as his operas, The Bartered Bride. He very much wanted to create a national style of music. And So what he did is he wrote programmatic nationalism. His first string quartet, program music, is titled From My Life. He wrote a suite of 6 symphonic poems called My Country. It took him about 8 years to write these 6 symphonic poems, each one a different aspect of life in Bohemia, the most famous of which is called the Moldau. And it is a symphonic telling of a trip, of a journey down the river Moldau, which is the river that flows through the heart of Bohemia. Out of the 6 symphonic poems from My Country, far and away the most popular and most famous, performed all the time. It's one of the most popular pieces in the repertoire. We'll listen to this in class. It's just different scenes from going down the river. It's a great piece, really cool piece. After Smetana came Antonin Dvorak. Now, Dvorak's a very important composer for a lot of different reasons. He was Bohemian. He was Czech. In addition to the operas that we talked about in chapter 28, he wrote 9 symphonies, of which the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th are performed frequently, especially the 8th and the 9th. The 8th and the 9th are among the most popular symphonies in the repertoire. Wrote 4 concertos. His cello concerto might be the most popular cello concerto in the repertoire. Many dances, called Bohemian dances. A lot of them were Slavonic dances. Many of them were originally written for piano, and then he orchestrated them. So you can hear them played on piano, or you can hear them by orchestra. He also wrote a lot of chamber music. He wrote some songs. He wrote some choral music. But today, Dvorak is probably best remembered for his symphonies, his cello concerto, his Slavonic dances, some of his sonatas as well. Now, Dvorak, we're going to listen to, time allowing, one of his Slavonic dances, originally piano 4 hands, and then orchestrated. We'll listen to both versions. It's fairly short. This is why Dvorak was so important. First of all, I already talked about this when I was talking about Brahms. As Robert and Clara Schumann kind of adopted Brahms as their musical protege, and they went out in the world and they touted Brahms' music and recommended him to conductors and to publishers and really helped Brahms get a start in his career, Brahms did the same thing for Dvorak. Brahms was very impressed by Dvorak's music, and he recommended him to his publisher and helped Dvorak really break into the business. Dvorak became incredibly popular all over Europe, and so popular, in fact, that the National Conservatory of Music in New York invited him to move to New York and become director of the conservatory. And he did, and he stayed there for 3 years, 1892 to 1895, I believe. One of his goals was to create a national style of composition in the United States. As he put it, the United States composers at that point were just imitating Europeans. They were trying to sound like third-rate Brahms and second-rate Tchaikovskys instead of trying to make music that sounded American. Remember, Dvorak believed very much in nationalism. Most of his music was nationalistic, Bohemian nationalism. He very famously, after coming to this country, told his students, told the musical community, there is a firm foundation for a truly American musical style here. And he saw it in the music of the Native Americans and African Americans. He was introduced to spirituals by a student of his named Harry T. Burleigh, B-U-R-L-E-I-G-H, I believe is how I spelled his name. And even today, actually, if you would go to any vocalist here and ask them if they've got copies of some spirituals for voice and piano, there's a pretty good chance that it was one of the arrangements done by Harry Burleigh well over 100 years ago. They were published and they're still very popular today. So something Dvorak decided to do was show American composers that you can write American music, and he did this by his one of his string quartets and his Ninth Symphony. His Ninth Symphony is subtitled From the New World, and it's his most popular, well, that and his Eighth Symphony, very, very popular. It's a 12-string quartet, which is nicknamed the American Quartet. Now, these were composed in Iowa, of all places. I think I've mentioned this in class, but Dvorak lived in New York, but in America, especially at that time, there were entire communities all across the country where when people emigrated from different countries, they tended to settle in the same areas. Like when people came over from Scandinavian countries like Finland and Norway, a lot of them settled in Minnesota. Why? Well, Minnesota probably reminded them a lot of the countryside and certainly the weather that you would find in Sweden and Finland and Norway. A lot of people who immigrated from Eastern Europe, from Czechoslovakia, from Germany, from places kind of in Central and Eastern Europe, emigrated to the Midwest. And there are entire towns out there who are populated almost entirely by immigrants. One of these towns is Spillville, which is a small town in Iowa, which I used to drive past all the time when I taught in Nebraska. When I was coming home to the East Coast to visit friends or family, we would always drive right past the exit for Spillville, Iowa. Never stopped though. It was a 20-hour drive. We were always kind of in a hurry. It was populated almost entirely by Czech immigrants, by Bohemian immigrants. So in the summertime, when school was out, Dvorak would go to Spillville, Iowa, where he could hang out and he could speak Czech and eat good Czechoslovakian food and just kind of be back in his element. So a lot of this music was actually written over the summertime when he was vacationing in Spillville, Iowa, surrounded by Czech people. I think it's kind of interesting, though, that the foundation for an American music was identified by a Czechoslovakian or Bohemian nationalist. And we will, of course, listen to some of Dvorak's music in class. Famous drawing of Dvorak conducting. Now, some other areas of Europe that we wanted very quickly, we're just going to talk about who the most important nationalists were. In Norway, Edvard Grieg, very, very important composer, wrote songs, wrote piano pieces, wrote orchestral pieces. I'll play some of the stuff from his Peer Gynt suite. Peer Gynt was a play, wrote incidental music for it. He arranged these into orchestral suites. Very popular. Two movements from Peer Gynt, in the Hall of the Mountain King and the Sunrise movement, they're musical stereotypes. They've been heard so many times. I'll play them for you. You will recognize them instantly. His Norwegian songs and his lyric pieces for piano, all very much Norwegian nationalism. How is it nationalist? Well, the influence of folk song, folk dances, and of course in the case of Peer Gynt, folk legend. In the United States, skip one. In England, Edward Elgar. Elgar is best known today as the guy who wrote Pomp and Circumstance. That was one of his 4 processional marches that he wrote. It's the one that for some reason got picked up in America as the one you play at all the graduations. He was the first English composer since Henry Purcell to become internationally famous. The Pomp and Circumstance marches, wrote 4 of them, as I said. An oratorio, The Dream of Gerontius, very popular, but he's probably best known for the Enigma variations. It's about a 30-minute long orchestral work, and it's a set of variations based on a specific theme. Each variation actually has a set of initials underneath it, because each one is about a person that he knew. So Elgar's Enigma Variations, he also wrote 2 symphonies which get some play, but the Enigma Variations, far and away his most performed concert work. Of course, the Pomp and Circumstance March No. 2 is his most performed work in this country. It's performed at every graduation. But Elgar's important because he's the first English composer in over 200 years since Henry Purcell to become internationally famous. In the United States, Amy Marcy Beach. Now remember, we talked about the first American composer to get any kind of international reputation, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the piano composer. Amy Marcy Beach was a great musician, a great composer. She was a child prodigy, but she was not allowed to go study music at the best universities because she was a woman. Sexism, right? I mean, even today, there's some of that going on. But she essentially was self-taught, and she wrote great music. She married a doctor, so she didn't have to teach. She didn't have to do anything to make money. She could just dedicate herself to her music. She actually became internationally recognized later in her life. And she's another composer that has been taken more seriously after her death because of the changes in society. There's a photograph of Amy Marcy Beach. Probably her most popular piece is her Gaelic Symphony. Fantastic piece. It's performed quite frequently. It's not in the repertoire with the frequency of, say, your Brahms symphonies, your late Dvorak, your Beethoven, but it does get performed with some frequency. Her Mass, her Piano Concerto. Her Piano Quintet gets a lot of play, chamber music. You can always stage more performances of chamber music because it doesn't require a huge orchestra. She also wrote songs, piano works, and choral music, but she was probably the first female composer of the late Romantic bridging into the 20th century to gain any kind of international reputation. Also in America at this time, this is when bands kind of started. A lot of this grew out of the regimental brass bands that were going on during the Civil War, and they converted into full wind bands. The Marine Band has been around for a couple hundred years, the U.S. Marine Band, but at one point in the late 1800s, every town had a community band. If you've ever seen the musical The Music Man, it's actually all about a guy starting a community band in a town. Only he's, of course, he's a crook, and he's basically people pay him for the instruments, and his plans to run away with the money, but that's a whole different story. There were also very, very famous bands that toured all over Europe. Basically, between the Civil War and World War I, concert bands were popular music. These very famous bands would tour all over the country, but every town had an amateur band as well, and everybody played an instrument, it seemed. The most important bandmaster in American history is John Philip Sousa. Sousa was originally the conductor of the Marine Band, and then when he left the Marines, he started his own concert band, which toured all over the world. It was the most famous band in all of North America, certainly, and probably internationally. Sousa wrote well over 100 marches. He also wrote some operettas, but Sousa's marches are the core of the American band repertoire from this time. Also in the United States at this time, it's really interesting because popular song begins to grow away from art song. Classical composers are continuing to write art songs, but Stephen Foster in the mid-1800s was the most popular American composer of song, but it kind of began to diverge a little bit. And what we began to see was they would write these popular songs for amateur performers, and they would publish them with the goal of selling as many of them as possible. This is where we got song form, verse, refrain, with a piano introduction, and then you would have a verse, usually 8, 16, or 32 bars, very, very balanced, somewhat like classical music, in how structurally balanced the songs were. And a lot of times, the refrain was sung in harmony, which is where now sometimes we think of verse, chorus. It was called the chorus because it was sung in harmony. Today, of course, some pop songs are like that, where the verse is in harmony, the chorus is in harmony, and for other people, the chorus is just another part of the song structurally. Tin Pan Alley was a nickname for a district in New York City where all the publishing houses were, and they all had composers. And these composers would go to work every day, and they'd sit there and they would write these popular songs, everyone hoping to produce a hit. Very famous American composers like George Gershwin and Jerome Kern got their start in Tin Pan Alley. Finally, the last thing in the chapter is probably the most significant influence on all of American music is the music of African Americans. We won't get into the social history of it. You've studied that before in other classes. As we know, African Americans brought to America as slaves after the Civil War. They were freed as slaves, but of course we had Jim Crow laws. We had indentured servitude, functionally. So the music that came over, and I'm not going to get into great detail on this because you'll study that. If you haven't taken African American music already, you will study this in great detail in African American music. But what we have is, we had work songs, we had spirituals, and a lot of commonalities, musical commonalities existed between the different kinds of music that were brought over by African Americans and continued to develop here during the slave culture. Call and response, where you have a soloist, and the response is usually the group. Improvisation was a very important part of this. Syncopated rhythms, a repetition of patterns, short rhythmic or melodic patterns, multiple layers of rhythm. Some of the music, traditional music of Africa, is so rhythmically complex, it's very, very difficult to notate. There are so many things going on. The bending of pitches or sliding from one pitch to another, all of these things had a tremendous influence in the blues and vis-a-vis then early jazz, and then into rhythm and blues, and then into popular music. If you look at a lot of these different traits, you'll recognize a lot of them from a lot of what's going into popular music today. Vocalizations, non-sung vocalizations like shouts, and then certain instruments which were based on traditional West African instruments, like an instrument which is basically a banjo. So that is a very important part of that. What happened was this music was all going on, of course, in the slave culture. Eventually, they became mainstream. They went into ragtime blues, which basically are the two direct predecessors of jazz, which influenced later popular music. However, in the 1800s, spirituals became very important. Go Down Moses was published in 1861, and a group called the Fisk Jubilee Singers from a college in Tennessee toured all over the United States and all over Europe singing spirituals arranged for chorus. They were a tremendously popular group, and by the end of the century, they had actually become popular. Spirituals had become an important part of popular music in all cultures in the United States, and eventually, as I said, they worked their way into early jazz and other very important things, forms of music. So America's greatest musical composition, artistic contribution to the world is, most people say, is jazz, and jazz grew out of ragtime and the blues, which grew out of this music that came over. As I said, I'm not going to get into great detail because you're going to take, if you haven't taken it already, you will take African American music where you will study this in depth. And there's a picture from the book, I don't know how well you can see it, of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And that's it. That is the end of chapter 30. We will now spend class on Friday, and class on Friday the 17th, and Monday the 20th, getting into more detail, listening to this music, looking at the scores, maybe do some quiz type stuff. And don't forget the online quiz that accompanies this lecture covers both chapter 29 and 30 and is available on Blackboard.